Remark 3. The unity whose moments, being and nothing, are inseparable, is at the same time different from these moments. It thus stands as a third with respect to them, a third which, in its most proper form, is becoming. Transition is the same as becoming, except that the two terms, from one of which the transition is made to the other, are represented in it more as at rest, outside each other, the transition occurring between them. Now, wherever and however being or nothing are at issue, this a third must be there. For the two have no subsistence on their own, but are only in becoming in this third. But this a third has various empirical shapes that abstraction either sets aside or neglects for the sake of holding fast to its two products, being and nothing, each for itself, showing them as protected against transition. Such a simple maneuver of abstraction can be countered, with equal ease, simply by pointing to the empirical concrete existence in which that abstraction itself is only a something, has a determinate existence. Or else it is by virtue of other forms of reflection that the separation of the inseparable would be held fixed. But in any such determination of reflection, its opposite is present within it and for itself, and it thus has possible to, and it is thus possible to refute it on its own terms, without going back to the nature of the fact and appealing to it, by taking the determination as it presents itself, and by pointing to its other in it. It would be labor in vain to attempt to ensnare, so to speak, all the shifts and turns of reflection and its argumentation in order to preempt and render impossible all the evasions and the leaps with which it hides its own contradiction from itself. For this reason, I also refrain from taking notice of the many self-styled objections and refutations that have been advanced against the claim that neither being nor nothing are something true, but that becoming is their truth. The intellectual education required to perceive the nothingness of these refutations, or rather, to dispel such arbitrary ideas on one's own, will be attained only through a critical cognition of the forms of the understanding. But those who are the most prolific in such objections straightway set themselves upon reflecting on the first propositions, without helping themselves or having helped themselves through further study of the logic to the awareness of the nature of their crude reflections. We shall consider some of the cases that occur when being and nothing are posited in isolation, each outside the sphere of the other, with the result that the transition is negated. Parmenides held fast to being and was the most consistent, since he also said of nothing that it absolutely is not, only being is. Totally for itself, being is thus the indeterminate, and has therefore no connecting reference to any other. Consequently, it seems that from this beginning no further forward move is possible, that is, from that beginning itself, and that an advance can only occur by adding something foreign to it from outside. The advance, where being is the same as nothing, thus appears as a second, absolute beginning. A transition is for itself, and that would be added to being externally. Being would not be an absolute beginning at all if it had a determinateness. In that case, it would depend on another and would not be immediate, would not be the beginning. If, however, it is indeterminate and is therefore a true beginning, it has nothing by virtue of which it can pass over to another. As beginning, it is equally the end. It is just as impossible for anything to break out of it as to break into it. With Parmenides as with Spinoza, there is no advance from being or from absolute substance to the negative, the finite. If there is forward movement, nevertheless, something which, as just remarked, can occur only externally if we start from being devoid of any connecting reference and so without forward movement. Then, this advance is a second, new beginning. Thus, Fichte's most absolute, unconditional first principle, A equals A, is a positing, a thesis. The second principle is a counterpositing, an antithesis. This latter should be partly conditioned, partly unconditioned, and so contradiction in itself. This is an advance by external reflection that negates the absolute with which it makes its beginning. The counterpositing is the negation of the first identity, while at the same time equally reducing its second absolute, explicitly, to something conditioned. But if there were any justification at all for the advance, that is, for sublating the first beginning, then the possibility that another could connect with it would have to lie in the nature of this first beginning itself. The beginning would have to be, therefore, a determinate being. But being, as also the absolute substance, will not be such, quite the contrary. Being is the immediate, the still absolutely indeterminate, the most eloquent, perhaps most forgotten accounts of the impossibility of advancing from an abstraction to something beyond it, and of the uniting the two, are given by Jacobi in support of his polemic against a Kantian a priori synthesis of self-consciousness. In his treatise, The Undertaking of Critique to Reduce Reason to the Understanding, Jacobi, Werke, Volume 3, he defines the task, page 113, as one of demonstrating the originating or the producing of a synthesis in a pure somewhat, be it consciousness, space, or time. Let space be a one, time a one, consciousness a one. Now, do you see how any of these three ones purely turns itself internally into a manifold? Each is a one and no other, and all the sameness, just selfhood in general without the he-hood, she-hood, or it-hood. For these still slumber together with the he, she, it, and the infinite zero, the indeterminate from which each and every determinate being has yet to proceed. What brings finitude into these three infinitudes? What impregnates space and time a priori with number and measure and turns them into a pure manifold? What brings pure spontaneity, I, into isolation, oscillation? Oops. How does its pure vowel sound come to its concomitant sound, the consonant, or better, how does its soundless, uninterrupted sounding interrupt itself and break off in order to gain at least some kind of self-sound, an accent? One sees that Jacobi very distinctly recognized that abstraction is a non-entity. Whether this non-entity is the so-called absolute only abstract space, or the equally abstract time, or abstract pure consciousness, the I, he insists on this non-entity for the sake of maintaining the impossibility of an advance to another, which is the condition of a synthesis, and to a synthesis itself. The synthesis, which is the point of interest here, must not be taken as a tying together of external determinations already at hand. Rather, the issue is twofold. One of the genesis of a second next to a first, of a determinate something next to something which is initially indeterminate, but also one of imminent synthesis, of synthesis a priori, a unity of distinct terms that exist in and for itself. Becoming is this immanent synthesis of being and nothing, but because the sense most closely attached to synthesis is that of an external gathering of things externally at hand, the name of synthesis, of synthetic unity, has rightly gone out of use. Jacobi asks, how does the pure vowel of the I come to its concomitant sound? The consonant? What brings determinacy to indeterminateness? The question of what would be easy to answer, and has been answered by Kant in his way, the question of the how, however, means in which way and manner, in what relation, and so forth, and requires the application of a particular category, but there can be no question here of a way or manner, of the categories of the understanding. The question of the how is itself one that belongs to the bad practices of reflection, which demands comprehensibility, but for that it presupposes its fixed categories and is thereby assured from the start to be forearmed against the answer to what it asks. Nor does the question have in Jacobi the higher sense of a query regarding the necessity of the synthesis. For Jacobi, as we said, remains fixed in the abstractions in order to assert the impossibility of the synthesis. Especially graphic is his description, page 147, of the procedure for attaining the abstraction of space. For a time, I must try to forget that I ever saw anything, heard, touched, or moved anything, myself expressly not exempted. Clean must I forget all movement, and let precisely this forgetting be my most pressing concern, since it is the hardest. Just as I have thought all things away, so must I also get perfectly rid of them all, retaining nothing at all, except the intuition, which violently held its ground of the infinite immutable space. I may not, therefore, think even myself back into it as something distinguished from it, yet equally bound to it. I may not let myself even be merely surrounded and pervaded by it, but I must rather give myself over to it totally, become a one with it, transform myself into it. I must allow no leftover of myself except this, my intuition itself, in order to behold it as a truly self-subsisting, independent, single, and sole representation. With this totally abstract purity of continuity, that is, with this indeterminateness and emptiness of representation, it is indifferent whether one names this abstraction space or pure intuition, or pure thought. It is altogether the same as what an Indian calls Brahma, when 4 years on end, looking only at the tip of his nose, externally motionless and equally unmoved in sensation, representation, fantasy, desire, and so on, he inwardly says only Om, 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 or else says nothing at all. This dull, empty consciousness, taken as consciousness, is just this, being. In this void, Jacobi now states further, he encounters the opposite of what should happen to him according to Kant's assurance. He does not find himself to be a many and a manifold, but to be rather a one without any plurality and manifoldness. Indeed, I am impossibility itself, the annihilating of all things manifold and plural, cannot, from my pure, absolutely simple and unchanging essence, produce again, or conjure in me as shadow, even the least bit of anything. Thus all externality and juxtaposition, any manifoldness and plurality dependent on them, are revealed in this purity as pure impossibility. The meaning of this impossibility is nothing else than the tautology I hold fast to abstract unity and exclude all plurality and manifoldness. I keep myself in indistinctness and indeterminacy, and look away from anything distinguished and determinate. Kant's a priori synthesis of self-consciousness, that is, the work of this unity of differentiating itself, but in this differentiation of preserving itself, is deluded by Jacobi to just this abstraction. He one-sidedly reduces the synthesis in itself, the original parting of judgment, to the copula in itself, and is, without beginning and end, without what, who, or which. This repetition of repetition ad infinitum is the one single occupation, function, and production of the purest of all syntheses. The synthesis is itself this mere, pure, absolute repetition, though, in fact, since there is no pause in it, that is, no negation, no distinguishing, the synthesis is not repetition, but rather undifferentiated simple being. But then, is this still a synthesis when Jacobi leaves out precisely that which makes the unity a synthetic unity? First of all, it must be said that when Jacobi assumes his position in absolute, that is, abstract space, time, and consciousness as well, he transposes himself into something which is empirically false, and fixes himself there. There is no such thing as a spatially or temporally unlimited space or time. That is, none is empirically at hand which would not be filled with the continuous manifold of limited existence and of change, so that these limits and these changes would not belong unseparated and inseparably to spatiality. Consciousness is likewise filled with determinate sensation, representation, desire, and so forth. It does not exist in concreto apart from some particular content or other. The transition to the empirical then goes without saying. Consciousness can indeed make empty space, empty time, and even empty consciousness or pure being, its intended object and content, but it does not stay with them. Rather, from this emptiness it passes over. More than that, it forces itself over to a better content, that is, one which is somehow more concrete, and to this extent, however bad as content, still better and truer. Precisely such a content is the synthetic as such, synthetic understood in its more general sense. Thus Parmenides has to make do with semblance and opinion, the opposite of being and truth. Spinoza likewise, with attributes, modes, extension, movement, understanding, will, and so forth, the synthesis contains as well as exposes the untruth of those abstractions. In it they are in unity with their other, are not therefore as self-subsisting, not as absolute, but strictly as relative. The demonstration of the empirical nullity of empty space and so forth is not, however, the task here. Consciousness can, of course, by means of abstraction, fill itself with such indeterminateness, and the abstractions to which it thus holds fast are the thoughts of pure space, time, pure consciousness, pure being. It is the thought of pure space, etc., that is, pure space, etc., taken in themselves, which is to be demonstrated to be null. That is, what must be demonstrated is that, as such a thought, its opposite has already forced its way into it, that by itself it is already being that has gone outside itself, a determinateness. But this happens in them immediately. They are, as Jacobi correctly describes them, results of abstraction. They are expressly determined as indeterminate, and this, to go back to their simplest form, is being. This indeterminateness is, however, precisely what constitutes their determinateness. For indeterminateness is opposed to determinateness. As opposed, it is therefore itself something determinate or negative, the pure, entirely abstract negative. This indeterminateness or abstract negation which thus gives voice when it equates such a being with nothing, when it declares it to be an empty product of thought, a nothingness. Or one can say, since being is the indeterminate, it is not the affirmative determinateness that it is. It is not being but nothing. In the pure reflection of the beginning as it is made in this logic with being as such, the transition is still hidden. Because being is posited as immediate, the nothing only breaks out in it immediately. All the subsequent determinations are, however, more concrete, like existence, which follows right after. There is already posited in existence that which contains and produces the contradiction of those abstractions, and consequently their transition. In being, when taken in that simplicity and immediacy, the memory that it is the result of a perfect abstraction, and that it is therefore already abstract negativity, nothing is left back behind the science which, starting explicitly from essence, will exhibit that one-sided immediacy as a mediated immediacy where being is posited as concrete existence, and that which mediates being, the ground, is also posited. In being, when taken in that simplicity and immediacy, the memory that it is the result of a perfect abstraction, and that it is therefore already abstract negativity, nothing is left back behind the science which, starting explicitly from essence, will exhibit that one-sided immediacy as a mediated immediacy where being is posited as concrete existence. And that which mediates being, the ground, is also posited. With the recovery of this memory, it is possible to present the transition from being to nothing, or also, as it is said, to clarify it and make it comprehensible, as something itself easy and trivial. Of course, the being which is made into the beginning of science is a nothing, since it is possible to abstract from everything, and when abstraction is made from all, nothing is left over. However, one can continue. So understood, the beginning is nothing affirmative, not being, but just nothing, and nothing is then the end, at least as much as immediate being, and even more so. Shortest is to let such an argument run its course and to observe how the results of which it boasts take shape. That nothing is the result of the argument, and that the beginning would then have to be made with nothing, as in Chinese philosophy, need not cause us to lift a finger. For even before we had lifted it, this nothing would have turned into being just as much. See section B above, nothing. But further, if we presuppose the set abstraction from everything, and everything which is inexistent, nevertheless, such an abstraction must be defined with greater exactitude. The result of such an abstraction from everything existent is first of all abstract being in general. For just as in the cosmological proof of the existence of God from the contingent being of the world, where we ascend above this contingent being is still taken up with us in the ascent. It is determined as infinite being. But of course, one can abstract also from this pure being. Being can be thrown in with the everything from which abstraction has already been made, and then nothing remains. Now, if we want to ignore the thinking of nothing, that is, that it turns around into being, or would know nothing of it, one can indeed proceed in this way in the style of the one can. One can, God be praised, even abstract from nothing, for the creation of the world, too, is an abstraction from nothing. But then, what remains is not nothing, since abstraction would be made even from it, and so we would be back at being again. This one can generate an external play of abstraction in which the abstracting itself is only the one-sided activity of the negative. Directly implied in this very one can is that being is just as indifferent to it as nothing, and that as the one vanishes, the other appears in turn. But whether a beginning is made with the activity of nothing or with nothing is equally indifferent, for the activity of nothing, that is, the mere abstracting, is neither more nor less true than the mere nothing. Plato's dialectical treatment of the one in the Parmenides must also be regarded rather as a dialectic of external reflection. Being and the one are both Eleatic forms which are the same thing, but as Plato understands them in that dialogue, they are also to be distinguished. After he removes from the one the various determinations of whole and parts, of being in itself, of being in another, etc., of figure, time, etc., his result is that being does not pertain to the one, for being does not accrue to a something except according to one of these forms. Ed Stephanus, Volume 2, page 141e. Plato then turns to the proposition, the one is, and it is therefore that we can see how, starting from this proposition, he performs the transition to the non-being of the one. It happens by way of a comparison between the two determinations of the presupposed proposition, namely, of the one is. This proposition contains the one and being, but the one is contains more than when one only says the one. In this, in their being distinguished, the moment of negation is demonstrated. It is clear that this method has a presupposition and is an external reflection. Just as the one is posited here in combination with being, so is being, which should be held fast abstracted by itself in the simplest from without entering into thought, exhibited in the combination that entails the opposite of what should be asserted. Taken in its immediacy, being belongs to a subject, is something said, has an empirical existence in general, and therefore stands on a ground of restriction and negativity. Whatever the expressions or the turns of phrase that the understanding adopts in protesting against the unity of being and nothing, however much it appeals to what is immediately given, it will find precisely in this experience nothing but determinate being. Being with a restriction or negation, the very unity which it rejects. The assertion of immediate being thus comes down to an empirical concrete existence, and it cannot reject a demonstration of it, since it is the immediacy outside thought to which it wants to cling. The same is the case with nothing, only in the contrary way. This is a well-known reflection, made often enough respecting nothing. When taken in its immediacy, nothing shows itself as existing, for it is by nature the same as being. Nothing is thought of, represented, it is spoken about, it therefore is. Nothing has its being in thinking, representing, speaking, etc. But further, this being is also distinguished from it. It is therefore said that nothing is indeed in thinking or representing. Yet for that very reason it is not it which is, it is not it to which being belongs. That only thinking or representing are this being. Even on this distinction, there is no denying that nothing refers to a being, but in this reference, though the latter equally also contains distinction, There is a unity with being. In whatever way nothing is said or demonstrated, it shows itself in combination with, or, if one prefers, in touch with a being, unseparated from a being, that is to say, precisely in a determinate existence. But when the presence of nothing in a determinate existence is thus demonstrated, this distinction of it from being still commonly comes to mind, namely that the existence of the nothing is nothing at all that pertains to it per se. It is said that nothing does not have being in it, that it is not being as such, that it is rather an absence of being, just as darkness is only the absence of light, cold only the absence of warmth, and so forth. It is said that darkness has meaning only with reference to the eye, by being externally compared with the positive, with light, just as cold is something only in our sensation, whereas light, warmth, just like being, are on the contrary objective on their own. They are the real, the effective, of quite another quality and dignity than those negatives, the nothing. One can often find it advanced as a very weighty reflection, and a significant item of cognition that darkness is only absence of light, cold only absence of warmth. Regarding this astute reflection, it can be observed empirically in this field of empirical subject matters that darkness in fact shows its effective presence in light by determining it as color and thereby imparting visibility to it in the first place, because, as we said above, one can see just as little in pure light as in pure darkness. Visibility, however, is an effect in the eye, and the said negative makes just as much of a contribution to it as does the light that passes for the real. The positive, similarly, cold makes itself present enough to water, to our sensation, and so forth, and if we deny its so-called objective reality, we thereby stand to gain absolutely nothing against it. And we should further repeat the complaint that here the talk is again of a negative with determinate content, that one has not restricted oneself to the nothing, with respect to which, so far as empty abstraction goes, being is neither at a loss nor at an advantage, but we must equally take cold, darkness, and similar determinate negations just for themselves, and in respect to their general determination which is at issue here, let us see what is posited thereby. They are supposed to be not nothing in general, but the nothing rather of light, warmth, and so forth, as something determinate of a content. Thus they are a determinate, contentful nothing, if one may so speak. A determinateness, however, as will be found later on, is itself a negation. Thus they are negative nothings. A negative nothing is, however, something affirmative. The conversion of nothing into an affirmative by virtue of its determinateness, which previously appeared as a determinate existence in a subject or in what have you, appears to a consciousness bound to the abstraction of the understanding as the greatest paradox. Simple as it is, or rather because of its very simplicity, the insight that the negation of negation is something positive appears a trivial matter to which the haughty understanding need pay no heed, even though its correctness is undeniable, and not just its correctness, but also, on account of the universality of the determinations involved, its infinite extension and universal applicability, so that it would indeed be well to pay heed to it. Regarding the determination of the transition of being and nothing into each other, the further remark can be made that such a transition is to be taken just as it is without additional reflective determination. It is immediate and entirely abstract, on account of the abstractness of the moments in transition, that is, because there is yet to be posited in these moments the determinateness of the other through which they have undergone the transition. Nothing is not yet posited in being, even though being is essentially nothing, and the other way around. It is therefore improper to apply here more determinate mediations, and to take being and nothing in some relation. Their transition is not yet a relation. Thus it is inadmissible to say, nothing is the ground of being, or being is the ground of nothing. Nothing is the cause of being, and so forth. Or the transition into nothing can have occurred only under the condition that something is, or the transition to being only under the condition of non-being. The mode of the connecting reference cannot be further determined without the connecting sides being at the same time also further determined. The connection of ground and consequent, and so forth, no longer has mere being and nothing for the sides which it binds, but has being expressly as ground, and something which, although only posited and not standing on its own, is however not abstract nothing.